Welcome to Talking Foreign Policy, the quarterly radio show and podcast produced by Case Western Reserve University and IdeaStream Public Media. I'm your host, Michael Scharf, Dean of Case Western Reserve University School of Law. Today, we're going to be talking about the need to update the 75-year-old Geneva Conventions on the law of war in light of the 21st century developments related to autonomous weapons, cyber warfare, and space war, as well as responding to modern-day terrorist groups. I've assembled an all-star panel of experts for today's conversation. From Washington, D.C., I'm pleased to welcome Sandy Hodgkinson, former Assistant Secretary of Defense for Detainee Affairs in the Pentagon and former Deputy Ambassador at Large for War Crimes Issues at the U.S. State Department. Thanks for joining us, Sandy.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
And also joining us from the nation's capital is Dr. Paul Williams, the president of the Nobel Peace Prize-nominated Public International Law and Policy Group. Paul, it's great to have you back on Talking Foreign Policy.
Oh, Michael, it's great to be back again.
That's great. And from West Virginia, we are joined by retired Navy Captain Dr. Greg Noon, who served as the head of the Pentagon's International Law Branch and is currently the director of Fairmont State University's National Security and Intelligence Program. Thanks for being with us, Greg.
Pleasure to be here, Michael.
Now, with me in the IDEA studio in Cleveland's Playhouse Square is Dr. Shannon French, a law of war expert who serves as director of the Inamori International Center for Ethics and Excellence at Case Western Reserve University. Welcome back to our show, Shannon.
Great to be here, Michael.
And finally, sitting right across the table from me is Milena Stereo, an international law expert who holds the Distinguished University Professorship at Cleveland State University. It's great to have you back on the show, Milena.
It's a pleasure to be here, Michael.
So let's start off with Milena. You know, they say all is fair in love and war, but that's not exactly true, at least the part about war, is it? Can you set the stage by telling us a little about the Geneva Conventions, what they outlaw, and how they're enforced?
The four Geneva Conventions were negotiated in the wake of World War II back in 1949 with the overall aim of protecting those who are not directly involved in warfare from the devastation of armed conflict. There are a total of four Geneva Conventions from 1949, and they protect the sick and the wounded in the armed forces, the sick and the wounded in the shipwrecked at sea, civilians, and prisoners of war. And the four Geneva Conventions were then updated in 1977 by two additional protocols, one of which applies to international armed conflict, and then the other one that applies to non-international armed conflict. In a nutshell, these treaties form the core of international humanitarian law and impose obligations on state parties to always distinguish between military and civilian objectives, to never cause disproportionate harm, to never cause excessive civilian harm and civilian damage, and to always use the least injurious means and methods of warfare. Now, the problem here is that these conventions are not necessarily always enforced, in particular because international law is difficult to enforce against powerful states like the United States, like Russia. But I would add that they're sometimes indirectly enforced through international criminal prosecutions at courts like the International Criminal Court, the tribunals that existed for the former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, and Cambodia.
And also, there's something in the Geneva Conventions called grave breaches, and any state in the whole world can prosecute anybody who's committed one of those, right?
Correct. These very serious violations, grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions, give rise to international crimes, war crimes, and typically the so-called principle of universal jurisdiction applies to such crimes, which means that any state in the world can prosecute those crimes.
All right. Well, we're happy to be here to celebrate the 75th anniversary of these wonderful conventions. Let me ask Sandy Hodgkinson, from your many years in the Navy, the Department of Defense, and the State Department, can you tell us about some of the successes of the Geneva Conventions over the past 7.5 decades?
Sure, I'm happy to. I think Milena Stereo did a wonderful job of laying out what the Geneva Conventions are and what they represent for the world community. You know, I believe the most significant success of the Geneva Conventions, however, is the fact that more than 180 states are party to them. This shows the strong adherence to the fundamental principles. Beyond that, they're widely understood and respected by professional armed forces around the world who undergo regular military training to make sure that they adhere to them in times of conflict. Geneva Conventions have also successfully withstood the test of time, even as warfare has changed through the updated protocols that Milena Stereo spoke about. As she mentioned, at the end of the Cold War, there was an increase in the number of civil wars between ethnic groups globally, and the concepts of international armed conflict from post-World War II were more challenging to apply to the conflicts that were occurring within a state. Protocols 1 and 2 from 1977 updated the Geneva Conventions to provide more guidance on conflicts occurring within a state, to include apartheid regimes, countries seeking freedom from colonial rule, and civil wars more generally. Another major success I'd like to highlight at this point is the fact that Geneva Conventions have been used as a legal basis for a significant and growing number of international and domestic tribunals to hold perpetrators of war crimes accountable. Milena Stereo mentioned the successful international tribunals for former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, Cambodia, and Sierra Leone, as well as domestic tribunals in Iraq and Rwanda, just to name a few. The ability to be able to prosecute war criminals after a conflict is extremely important, and the Geneva Conventions give us a foundation to do that in international law, which in many cases has also been implemented into domestic law around the world.
So, Sandy, when there is a conflict, do you feel like the two sides are generally complying by the Geneva Conventions? Because we always see in the news the stories about the violations, not the compliance.
I believe that generally nations follow the Geneva Conventions, not just because it's international law and there can be repercussions through tribunals and otherwise, but because it's the right thing to do. I think nations who have responsible military forces desire to follow the rules in general. They're proud to wear the uniform that they wear, and they want to act responsibly. They just need to understand how to do it and what the laws are that they should follow.
All right, so Sandy said the Geneva Conventions have largely survived the test of time. But they were negotiated before the age of computers, before spaceflight, before robotics. Let's start with a discussion of autonomous weapons system, sometimes referred to as killer robots. You know, it sounds like something from the Terminator movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger, but the technology is rapidly developing. So, Greg Noon, you are an expert at the military. Can you tell us about the state of this technology?
Yeah, thank you, Michael. And I'll promise not to do an Arnold imitation here. But look, these aren't necessarily killer robots. Autonomous weapon systems are generally in three categories. First is a human in the loop or semi-autonomous systems. These require a human to direct the system to select a target and attack it. So think of like a Predator or Reaper UAV, or as commonly referred to as drones. The second is a human on the loop or human supervised autonomous systems. And these weapon systems select targets and attack them, but with the human operator oversight. So examples would include Israel's Iron Dome, the U.S. Navy Phalanx close-in weapon systems, or CWIS. And then the third one is the human out of the loop, or a fully autonomous weapon system that can attack without any human interaction. And that's with the advent of AI, that will be the next thing that people try to develop. And that's really where the line, it probably gets blurred and goes out of touch.
All right, so let's focus on that third category. Dr. Shannon French, you've studied this issue closely for many years. Tell us about the legal and ethical concerns that fully autonomous weapon systems of the third category raise.
Well, first of all, Michael, my colleagues mentioned already two of the absolutely central tenets of the just war tradition, which are distinction, or discrimination as it's sometimes called, and proportionality. So put most simply, the first one is about who do you target, and the second is about how much force do you use. Both of those are unbelievably complicated calculations to make, and I shouldn't even use the word calculation, because one of the main problems you have with autonomous weapons is in order for one of these systems to take over these kind of decisions, it has to be coded. It has to be put into something that a machine can calculate and understand. But ethics is messy. And it's not messy in a reducible way. It's messy because the world itself is that complicated. So one of the core concerns that comes around to the issue of accountability, and that would be in the law or in ethics, is how could we ever know that an autonomous machine is going to decide on topics or decide on targets or decide on the level of force in a way that we can understand and justify, when in many cases it's a literal black box and we won't even know how they made that determination.
I'm reminded of the debate that goes on with autonomous self-driving vehicles. And everybody's afraid, what if the vehicle doesn't make the right decision? And one of the answers is, well, humans don't make the right decisions either. How do you respond to that issue with respect to autonomous weapons?
Well, one of the key answers to that is to point out that when a human makes a mistake, we have ways of making humans accountable for that actually depend on our shared humanity. In other words, if someone wrongs me, I want them to know the weight of what they did. I want them to feel the moral weight of it. And it's pretty meaningless if a machine wrongs me. If I bump into a table, I'm not going to get anything back from the table in terms of an apology or any meaningful reconciliation. But with a human, I can. When we turn these things over to self-driving cars or to machines, the question isn't so much about error rates. It's about who do you hold responsible and how do we ever heal or move on from any harms?
All right. So, Paul Williams, you are an experienced international negotiator. What might be the elements of a new Geneva Convention to address the challenges that Shannon French is talking about of fully autonomous weapons?
Well, Michael, I think one of the first elements that's going to be negotiated is defining and classifying these types of autonomous weapons. Greg did a great job. There's humans in the loop, humans on the loop, and humans out of the loop. But those are really 3 points on a very broad spectrum. You could imagine dozens of variations of humans in, on, or out of the loop. And how do you define that? How do you classify what system would be subject to the controls of a new Geneva Convention, or what systems are outside of the controls of the convention? And how do you negotiate what is meaningful human input? As Shannon had mentioned, there's a degree of accountability if you have a human at the controls. What if they're asleep at the controls? What if they're not paying attention? How do you define that level of human engagement? And I think that's going to be 2 hotly contested issues, as well as a third issue of robust accountability mechanism. As Sandy and Milena have pointed out, there's an emerging trend of criminal accountability for violations of the laws and customs of war. How do you hold a machine accountable? Or how do you hold a human who's just on the loop, but not actually in the loop, accountable? And I think you could have a fairly quick erosion of the criminal accountability that we've seen built up over the last 3 decades.
All right. Well,
and then the ethical considerations are going to be crucial as well.
I think we see a theme developing here that's going to apply for the rest of the program as well. It's going to be really difficult to have a new Geneva Convention that deals with these new developments. But it is time for a short break. Now, don't worry. You won't be hearing anything from Skynet while we're off. But when we return, we'll talk about the need for a new Geneva Convention to address 2 other emerging areas, cyber warfare and space warfare. Stay with us. Welcome back to Talking Foreign Policy, brought to you by Case Western Reserve University and IdeaStream Public Media. I'm Michael Scharf, the Dean of Case Western Reserve University School of Law. We're joined today from our nation's capital by former Assistant Secretary of Defense Sandy Hodgkinson and Dr. Paul Williams, the president of the Public International Law and Policy Group. From West Virginia, we have the former head of the Pentagon's International Law Branch, Greg Noon. And with me here in the IDEA studio is Professor Milena Stereo of Cleveland State University College of Law and Dr. Shannon French, director of the Inamori International Center for Ethics and Excellence. We've been talking about the need to update the 75-year-old Geneva Conventions on the laws of war in the face of 21st century technology. In this segment of our show, we're going to be discussing the need for a new Geneva Convention to deal with cyber warfare and space warfare. Let's begin with cyber warfare, and we'll bring in Greg Noon. Greg, it's said that there is a cyber arms race underway. Can you tell us about that? What are all the types of cyber warfare?
Well, I don't think we have enough time, to be honest with you. But the short answer is yes and no. And in the area of cyber-enabled weapons, there's an arms race, right? So the Chinese and the Americans are considering drone swarm technology enabled by AI that can attack aircraft carriers or defend them. The other weapons that are enhanced by cyber, like drones and missiles. So from that end of the spectrum, yes, there's a full-on arms race. And then on the other end, where you start talking about things like disinformation and misinformation campaigns, especially that the Russians are very proficient at, and getting into elections or putting, like the ghostwriter as an example, where the Russians planted fake anti-NATO correspondence in the inbox of Polish and Baltic countries' military and political leaders. So it would appear that they're less enthusiastic about NATO. So there's those types of things. And of course, the Chinese are the masters of the economic espionage, on and on and on. So yes and no.
And Greg, what about things like Stuxnet, which is that virus that was inserted into the Iranian nuclear weapons development that set them back? Things like that. Or is that part of this fear as well?
Yeah, so this is the conversation, and I look forward to hearing from some of my colleagues, but this is a conversation that we're trying to get our arms around. When is a cyber attack an armed attack? Does it have to have the equivalence of a kinetic weapon where people die? Or does it or can it just shut down the economy or shut down a factory? So these are the things that everybody is talking about and trying to get their head around with respect to the burgeoning cyber domain.
All right, so that brings me to Paul Williams and the $10,000 question. Paul, in what ways do the Geneva Conventions fail to deal with the kind of cyber warfare that Greg has been describing?
Well, Michael, I think it's important to bear in mind what Sandy said in her remarks initially, which is the conventions were negotiated 75 years ago and they were updated 50 years ago. They really do focus on traditional World War I, World War II type of, as Greg would say, kinetic conflicts, shooting, shelling, bombing, etc. They don't really envision cyber warfare. And so what lawyers like us are trying to do is figure out how you can bend over the Geneva Conventions so that they can apply to these type of cyber crimes, but they're really not fit for purpose. They don't address the dramatic economic harm that could be carried out by cyber attacks or by the non-state armed actors. The protocols do, to a degree, address non-state armed actors, but these could be troll farms associated or not associated with states. They could be sympathetic hackers. There's, when is it a state-sponsored attack, which has accountability consequences, or when is it just a group of a couple dozen folks who want to cause harm because they have an affinity for one state over another state? It's, I guess, bottom line, they're not fit for purposes. We might need a whole new protocol or a whole new set of rules and regulations to govern cybercrime and its consequences, or cyber attacks, cyber warfare and its consequences.
All right. So Paul mentioned Sandy Hodgkinson. She's our former Assistant Secretary of Defense. Sandy, international experts have authored something called the Talon Manual 2.0 to try to deal with cyber warfare. Can you tell us about that project?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to. I'm going to back up a little bit and talk about the Talon Manual project overall. The first series, the original Talon Manual, was actually put together in Tallinn, Estonia. This was the site of a notorious cyber attack in 2007 that was attributed to the Russians, but has been questioned as to whether it was a state act or whether or not it was individual actors. And it was considered by many to be more of an armed attack than others. So this promulgated the question that Paul Williams was just talking about, which is what is an armed attack? And so the Tallinn Manual Project was put in Tallinn, Estonia, at the NATO Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence. And a series of prominent international legal experts came together to try to address the international law governing cyber operations. In particular, the original Tallinn Manual was published in 2013 and addressed principally the law of armed conflict as it applies to cyber operations. The first and initial question was, what constitutes a cyber attack under the law of war, akin to an armed attack launched by any other means, and thereby justifying a response in self-defense of a nation? That was Tallinn 1. The Tallinn Manual 2.0, which Michael, you just referenced, was the second version published in 2017, and it expanded on the first one to cover international law governing cyber operations in peacetime legal regimes. So maybe not necessarily when there is a state involved in the conflict, but more akin to individual actors or carried out by surrogates. As you can imagine, a Tallinn Manual number 3.0 is underway as we speak, and like the previous two, is expected to be a 5-year project to ensure that it's current with the evolving nature of cyber operations. All of this is to say that even when we're discussing whether or not the Geneva Conventions need to be updated in some meaningful way, international legal experts around the world are coming together to try to find ways to close gaps or interpret existing law in a way that helps provide more guidance, again, to those professional militaries around the world that I believe just want guidance so they can do the right thing.
Now, the thing about a manual is it's soft law, whereas the conventions themselves are hard law treaties with consequences. So I noticed that Microsoft, of all places, has proposed something called the Digital Geneva Conventions. Milena Stereo, can you tell us about that one?
Sure. So this is a proposal that goes back to 2017 when the then Microsoft president spoke about it at a large conference. And the gist of it would be to create a new convention that would establish a new set of norms and rules that would protect civilians from state-sponsored cyber attacks. Now, there were already some initiatives on the way. So, for example, back in 2015, there was a United Nations government group of experts that had already proposed a new set of rules and principles for states in cyberspace. And then there was a 2017 Global Commission for the Stability of Cyberspace, which was launched by the Dutch government and a group of NGOs and think tanks that would also develop proposals for norms governing state behavior in cyberspace. And so in a nutshell, this would be a type of a Geneva Convention developed to protect civilians from state-sponsored cyber attacks. Is it a good idea? I think so. The question is, we start quibbling about the content, what exactly it says. And then the other question, obviously, is, does it have an actual impact in terms of updating the actual Geneva Conventions?
All right, let's now talk about space warfare. Greg Noon, why should we worry about application of the rules of warfare to outer space?
Yeah, that's a great question. In the short answer is the law of armed conflict applies to outer space. That's the U.S. position. That's the International Committee of the Red Cross position, NATO's position, our other allies, Australia, New Zealand. And it's important because there's a massive amount of satellites up in space that have military applications, that have civilian applications, that have dual applications. I mean, what's going on up there is an integral part of our military operations right now, from GPS to ISR, which is intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. That's going to be the first place. The next big war will start there with the idea that you can blind the enemy. That's why in the United States military, and I'm sure in other militaries, they still teach people how to navigate a ship using the stars and sextants, just in case all the gear goes down.
And Greg, not only the satellites, but we're reaching an era where there's going to be space tourism, space hotels. There's going to be mining of the moon, mining of the asteroids, and all of these facilities are going to become increasingly important and also vulnerable to attack, right?
Yeah, for sure. And you go through the same analysis that we do, as Shannon spoke about earlier, about distinction and proportionality. That would apply up there as well.
All right, so Shannon French, is it true that there is now a new field called space ethics that's related to military ethics? What unique issues arise in that field, and who's working on them?
Well, yes, it's absolutely true, and it's a growing field, so we will in 10 years all have heard of it. But there are issues that relate to who owns what, which is a huge issue, of course, in what is effectively uncharted territory, to sound very Star Trek. And also there are issues about some of the ways you heard Greg talk about dual use, some of the ways that wars could be accidentally started. It's easy to think in terms of someone intentionally blowing up a satellite. But right now, few people understand there is an immense amount of debris in close outer space, if you will, in orbit around us. And there's a lot of urgency now building to deal with this problem. But people are genuinely concerned that if you start trying to blow up space debris, it could be interpreted as an armed attack or some kind of act of war. So that's a piece of it. So there are issues of territoriality. There are issues of how do you deal with things in space, all of these coming together. One of the names you should keep in mind is Australian Nikki Coleman. And she actually moved over from military ethics into space ethics because so many issues were arising here that she was fascinated by. But she's not the only one. But I recommend her work and many others.
All right. So Greg was saying that the principles of the Geneva Convention apply in outer space as well as terrestrially. The most important principles of the Geneva Convention that we've been hearing about today have been discrimination, which means you cannot target civilians, only the military, necessity and proportionality, which means when you're targeting a military site, there has to be a reason for it. And if there are going to be civilians injured, who are collateral damage, those injuries have to be proportionate. So let me ask our panelists how those principles might apply to a few hypothetical situations relating to space warfare. Let's start with Greg. If a country's satellite is destroyed by another country, can the victim country respond by destroying a satellite of the attacking country, tit for tat?
Yeah, so the first question that we would ask is it an armed attack? Is it part of an armed conflict, like Shannon noted, or is it some other accident? But there are offensive weapons put in space. There are capture and kill satellites that cozy up next to another satellite and grab it and pull it inside. There's kamikaze satellites that blast into the satellite, so both are destroyed. So we'd have to do an analysis. Facts matter, right? And so we'd have to do an analysis. What kind of satellite is it? Is it a government satellite? Is it a military satellite? Can I use force in self-defense? And is a satellite a lawful target? If it's a military objective, it's used by the military and it's a lawful target. If it's a civilian, what's the proportionality here? What if that satellite is used for tsunami warnings or emergency response? So are people
Greg,
going to die
what if it's like a weather satellite or something like you're describing, but it also undertakes military surveillance, so it's dual use? Then what?
Right. And so then you have to do the linkage between whatever that thing is and is it supporting the military? So we talk about this on the ground in Ukraine with respect to electrical grids or anywhere really. And you can take out the electric that's powering the military, but that doesn't mean you can turn the whole country dark to freeze people in their homes. So you have to do an analysis, and like I said, facts matter on how this is linked to the military.
So this gets a little bit complicated. Let me ask Sandy Hodgkinson to sort of connect the dots. What if the victim country responds not by destroying, another satellite in outer space, but by destroying the attacking country's launch facility or its mission control center?
Well, I would say that, that's okay. It's lawful under the Geneva Conventions as they're currently written. As long as the victim country suffers what Dr. Noon has described as an armed attack, per his analysis, that there is a military objective that has been attacked and that a response would not be disproportionate to the concrete military objective to be achieved, then a proportional response on a military target, such as a national launch facility or its mission control, would be considered lawful. Again, the entire analysis comes down on, was it an armed attack as considered such under the Geneva Conventions? And if so, any proportional response on a military object would be considered lawful.
Well, it sounds like these are going to be really complicated. There's going to be some gray areas. So let me turn to Milena Stereo. I have heard that University of Adelaide, University of Exeter, University of Nebraska, and University of New South Wales have developed something called the Woomera Manual Project to clarify the Geneva Convention's application to military space operations like we've been talking about. Can you tell us about that project?
Sure, Michael. This is a joint research project that spans countries and continents, and the ultimate goal is to develop a manual that would objectively both articulate and clarify existing international law applicable to military operations. And this manual was just recently published by Oxford University Press. Now, this is not it's revolutionary, but not revolutionary, because we've seen other efforts. So, for example, Sandy Hodgkinson talked about the Talon Manual. There's also the so-called San Remo Manual of International Law applicable to armed conflict at sea, and also the Harvard Manual applicable to air and missile warfare. And so these are just efforts to clarify and update the existing law through these so-called soft law instruments.
Well, it sounds like they're making some progress there, and there's a lot farther to go. It is time for another short break. When we return, we're going to be discussing the challenge of applying the Geneva Conventions to modern-day terrorists. Back in a moment. This is Michael Scharf, Dean of Case Western Reserve University School of Law, and we're back with Talking Foreign Policy. I'm joined today by experts on the military, diplomatic, and legal aspects of the laws of war. And we're talking about the need for a new Geneva Convention in an era of modern warfare. In this final segment, we're going to be focusing on application of the Geneva Conventions to terrorists. The issue first arose in the fore of the aftermath of the al-Qaeda attacks on 9/11. The international community then grappled with it again in responding to the ISIS terrorist group, and it's relevant to the current Gaza conflict between Israel and Hamas. So let's start with Sandy Hodgkinson, who served as Assistant Secretary of Defense for Detainee Affairs. Couldn't have gotten a better expert for this particular topic. Now, let's start off, Sandy. Can you tell us what your job entailed and what that experience was like?
Sure. The DASD, as they call it, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Detainee Affairs position, was created at the Pentagon in response to the substantiated claims of detainee abuse at Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq, which is a place I served as a diplomat from the State Department. I didn't serve in the prison, but I served there in Baghdad. The sole purpose of this new position was to ensure humane treatment policies and oversight for detainees that were under U.S. control following the 9/11 attacks, our war on terrorism, and the Iraq War. Personally, I really enjoyed serving in this capacity and believe the office effectively managed the twin aims of the U.S. government, which were both to win the war on terrorism by the humane detention of terrorists who sought to bring down the U.S. through unlawful means, like the 9/11 attacks, and the other aim, which was to the need to show the world that this can be done under a legal regime, the law of armed conflict, which would then show the U.S. commitment and enduring commitment to the rule of law. This office was responsible for pressing the Department of Defense to write a new policy that required, under the Geneva Conventions, that Common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions would be applied in all conflicts, whether international or internal, and in all military operations. The Common Article 3 policy of humane treatment became, in the U.S. military, the gold standard and the standard that all military operations around the world continue to live under today. So it was an exciting time for sure, with lots of challenges, but I enjoyed the challenge.
So let me ask you, Sandy, humane treatment is a good standard, but it's not as high as the standard that POWs need to be treated. Is that correct? There's a difference, right?
There is.
Okay. And originally during the Bush administration, and I'm not even sure, if it changed or not during the Obama administration, but originally there was a disagreement about whether terrorists should be treated as civilian terrorists who got humane treatment or POWs who got that higher standard. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. So the U.S. position, surprisingly, has remained relatively consistent across administrations. Despite the rhetoric, the application of the law has in both administrations, both Bush and Obama, been principally the same with focus in different areas and different analysis. And that position is founded on the Geneva Convention itself. The Geneva Conventions are clear under the Third Geneva Convention for Prisoner of War that regular members of a state's armed forces, so the armed force of the United States, for example, would be entitled to POW status if they were captured. In order to receive this high sort of gold standard, as you refer to it, Michael, you need to follow a series of criteria. Well, first, if you're a member of the regular armed forces, you automatically get it. So wearing a uniform, you automatically get it if you're part of the U.S. military force. If you're not a lawful member of a military force, as in the case of al-Qaeda, where they were terrorists and weren't allied with any particular nation's military force, members of an irregular force like that need to meet 4 criteria under the Geneva Conventions that are specifically laid out in order to be considered a lawful combatant. Those 4 criteria are, first, they must follow responsible command. Very possible that al-Qaeda followed the command of its leadership and Osama bin Laden. The second criteria is they have to distinguish themselves from the civilian population with a distinctive insignia. That could be wearing a uniform, it could be wearing the same outfit, it could be the same hat, but it has to be something distinctive, and that is not something that al-Qaeda has done. Third, they have to carry their weapons openly. That means that you have to be able to see the weapons and know that you're fighting an enemy force. And again, in the case of al-Qaeda, post 9/11, they were carrying out surprise attacks, hiding weapons in various places, and using the fact that you couldn't tell they were an armed force from the civilian population to carry them out. Lastly, you have to follow the law of armed conflict, which means follow all of the other provisions of the Geneva Conventions in order to be considered a military and entitled to this great status of POW, the gold standard. So because al-Qaeda did not carry the weapons openly, as I described, and carried out these surprise attacks, and they didn't follow the law of armed conflict, they were not entitled legally to POW status. And as a result, they were determined to be unlawful or illegal combatants.
Now let me turn to, I'm sorry.
Just one
Go
comment.
ahead, Sandy.
Reasonable minds differ as to whether or not they should be afforded a higher standard
That's where I was
than
going.
what they legally earn. Yeah, as a show of our high morality as a nation. And so that is where the debate has been, is should they get a higher status? The pro is that it shows the U.S. morality to hold them higher. The counter to that is that it encourages other would-be terrorists to continue to violate the law of war and receive better treatment. So it's an incentive.
All right. So even under the humane standard, there was a lot of stuff. It's kind of a looser standard. So a lot of bad things were happening to these people that we found out about after the fact. Let me turn to Milena Stereo. Sandy described the U.S. position, but you know full well what the rest of the world was thinking about this. Can you describe their reaction to our classifications of terrorists?
Sure. So the classification of terrorists as unlawful enemy combatants is a term of art that was really invented by the Bush administration. That term is not in the Geneva Conventions. It's not in any of the 4 Geneva Conventions. It's not in any of the additional protocols. And actually, those conventions and protocols distinguish between 2 categories only, combatants and civilians. And so the argument there would be that even if you're not treating someone as a combatant, you have to classify them as a civilian, and you surely cannot torture, waterboard, mistreat civilians.
All right. So around the world, there was a big debate about this classification system on terrorists. Greg Noon, could a new Geneva Convention help clarify the law internationally on this?
I'm not so sure it could. And to Melena's point, unlawful enemy combatant, that was, in my opinion, the Bush administration's effort to try to label these people and tell the world what they're doing. But she's right. There is no such thing as unlawful enemy combatant. And it's you're either a combatant or you're not. In fact, when we define civilians in the Geneva Conventions, we use a negative definition. If you're not a combatant, you're a civilian. That's it. And so the idea that we could change it to somehow fix this is problematic, because we're trying to incentivize people, as Sandy said, to follow the law of armed conflict. So if you follow the law of armed conflict, you fight it right, as it were, then you get combatant immunity, which means that all the people that you are shooting at lawfully in your mission, you don't get prosecuted for murder. You're immune from that. Now, if we find out you're over on the side doing bad things to civilians, you can get prosecuted for that. And the other incentive is, Sandy said, the gold standard, being a POW. You know, many years ago in the late 80s, I was in Germany and I met an old timer, and he found out I was from America. And he said, America, best 3 years of my life. He had been a POW in America. And, you know, clean sheets, hot food, beautiful women riding by on bicycles. What a country. And that's what you want. You want that incentive to follow the rules, and then you get rewarded for it. If you're allowing people to not follow the rules and then still give them the rewards, you're lessening the incentive to actually get it right.
All right. Well, so treatment of detainees is one area where there's a conflict of opinions around the world. But another area where the Geneva Conventions might be clarified involves the targeting of terrorists using drones. So, Shannon French, you mentioned drones earlier in the broadcast. Can you tell us about this type of warfare and the ethical and legal concerns that it raises?
Well, it follows quite perfectly on the conversation that we were all having just a moment ago, because unfortunately, this creation of additional gray around who is or is not a combatant is problematic in this area of drones. Because if you think about it, in ordinary combat, if you can even talk about that anymore, there's an understanding that soldiers do not stop being targets or legitimate targets unless they become wounded and surrendered, and then they are entered into the care of their enemy. So, for example, one of the common examples that people use is this awkward point that a soldier who is naked taking a shower can still be shot and killed because they're still a soldier, and it's not about them being a threat at that particular moment. The trouble is that is not how we treat, for example, criminal civilians. There are much different rules that come around that. And many people have argued that the treatment of terrorists should be much closer to criminal treatment. So, for example, with someone even of the magnitude of evil of Osama bin Laden, the goal should be to prosecute them. The goal should be to take them into custody and prosecute them, not to shoot them unless they're in the moment of shooting at you, as you would with a criminal. So with drones, you're targeting a particular individual, sometimes hunting and tracking them for a very long time and then taking the kill shot. And it falls outside of either of these paradigms comfortably when we're in this realm of this new category we've invented.
So, Milena, let me turn to you. Under the Geneva Conventions, would it be lawful for a country like the United States to use a drone to kill a terrorist leader like Osama bin Laden anywhere in the world that he happens to be located?
So, Michael, this is a tricky area of the law where the United States' position has been that the United States can use force on the territory of third states if they're unable or unwilling to combat terrorism, on their territory. Now, from the perspective of international humanitarian law, which we've been discussing, it depends on whether you're respecting the core principles of IHL, such as distinction, proportionality, precautions. So, for example, the terrorist, are they a combatant? If they're a combatant, they're a lawful military target. Yes, they can be targeted through a drone attack. Proportionality. Are you going to cause significant civilian casualties through the drone attack? And I think this is the trickiest one. So that might dictate, for example, that instead of launching a drone while the person is attending a wedding and is surrounded by hundreds of other civilians, maybe you have to wait for the next day until they're alone in the car. And the last principle of precautions, which dictates that you use the least injurious means and methods of warfare, also says that maybe you can't use a drone if the person is constantly in a highly populated civilian area. Maybe instead you have to to use Navy SEALs, like, for example, what was the case with Osama bin Laden. So it really depends on the circumstances of where the person is and whether you, by launching your attack, whether you can still launch the attack by respecting the relevant principles of IHL.
Now, for a terrorist to be a legitimate target, as you're describing it, does it matter how high up they are? So we've been talking about Osama bin Laden, the leader of al-Qaeda at the time. But what about someone who is a terrorist bomb maker? Or what if it's just a terrorist foot soldier? Are they all legitimate targets?
They can be, although it depends on how we define combatants. So there's been some disagreement in the international arena, notably with Israel taking the most aggressive view of who might be a combatant. But essentially, I would say that the well accepted view is that the persons taking direct part in the hostilities can be considered combatants. So long as you're taking a direct part in the hostilities, you'd be considered a combatant. But this issue of hierarchy, who you are, whether you are a foot soldier or whether you're the leader, that actually goes to this issue of proportionality, whereby you can probably, however awful this sounds, you can cause a higher amount of civilian death, civilian damage, if you're targeting someone like Osama bin Laden, who's the leader of al-Qaeda, because they are a high-value target, as opposed to you're targeting just a foot soldier.
Now, Shannon French, back during the Bush administration, the government took the position that we were in a continuous armed conflict with al-Qaeda and that it extended all over the world. And now Malena's put a gloss on that says, well, we can only kill a terrorist with a targeted killing operation if it's a country where the country's unable or unwilling to take care of the terrorists themselves. But what do you think about that characterization of this war against al-Qaeda and now ISIS and maybe other terrorist groups as worldwide and continuous?
Well, so we've discussed before the way that acronyms can be misused, and the one for this was GWOT, the Global War on Terror. I don't like wars on concepts. In this case, I would call that a war on a tactic, because what terrorism is a particular way of fighting. And the trouble with GWOT and its approach is that it was what got us stuck, and us being the U.S. in this case, but our allies as well, in what were called the forever wars. When you're at war with something like terrorism, how do you win? What does victory look like? How do you know when you're at the end? If you take on something like a concept, you can't have a set victory and an end point to the hostilities. You are stuck in it forever.
All right, so Malena, how might the Geneva Conventions be updated to clarify the law governing these scenarios?
Well, Michael, first of all, it's very difficult to update any treaty because you'd have to get all the states that negotiated the treaty back together and willing to renegotiate. I don't think we're going to see that anytime soon. But some of the theoretical updates that could be useful would be, for example, to precisely define what is a combatant and what is a civilian, because I do think that we have some disagreement there. Maybe to develop scenarios of proportionality, like how do we actually apply this principle of proportionality, and then to maybe include more specific discussions of some of the more modern day weapons that we have, such as drones and other autonomous weapon systems.
Well, I have about 30 more questions for the panel, but it's time to bring our program to a close. So I'd like to thank our experts for sharing their expertise on the need for a new Geneva Convention for cyber warfare, space warfare, autonomous weapons, and modern-day terrorism. Sandy Hodgkinson, Greg Noon, Paul Williams, Shannon French, and Malena Stereo, thank you for providing your insights about this important topic. And if this topic is of further interest, Case Western Reserve University School of Law will be hosting a day-long symposium on it on September 27th, and you can attend in person or by webcast. I'm Michael Scharf. You've been listening to Talking Foreign Policy.